everyone, and welcome back. I'm just going over a worksheet here, trying to figure out how to manage time in a video that I'm doing. And one of the things you can do in your class, in your interactive workshop that you're holding on Zoom, is think very deliberately about the chunking of time. So this is something that we do in all of our classes. If you're giving a lecture, you do it. It's very important because if you're not organized in terms of time, you'll miss out on covering some of the content that you intended. Working in things like breaks, thinking about time that you're going to need for a quiz, whether you're teaching in person or in a distance modality here on Zoom, is something you just really have to do. It's also really important if you're giving a public talk where you think about the specific sections you're covering, and then you go through and rehearse that, of course, and then you figure out your PowerPoint slides if you're using slides based on the amount of time you need to spend on each of those sections. So it's something probably we do all the time, but it's maybe not something we think about in terms of a Zoom session, because I think Zoom has really changed the way that we see and experience people. It's changed the way that we deliver some of our content in our classes. But it's a great opportunity to think about approaches to chunking time in your class such that you can be more effective and efficient. That's kind of goal one. But the second goal, I think, really relates to this series on interactive and immersive approaches in your Zoom class. And it really is getting at the idea of breaking things up such that people don't get bored. So as an example of this, in a traditional class, I might take my outline and I might say for the first 10 minutes, I would do a check-in about the last week's assignment, or maybe they had a quiz or a paper. I could say, you received your scores, or I'm giving you your papers back today, and here's some areas for improvement in general. If you have questions, come see me in office hours. And then maybe the next section of the class, I do a short lecture where I introduce a concept, whatever that is, concept A. And then for 20 minutes, I do discussions in groups. And then I take a 5-minute break, come back. Students would present what they talked about in their discussion groups. So the chunking of time in the case here is doing two things. It's creating certainly efficiency. It's allowing me to get through specific content areas I need to get through, but it really is breaking things up to reduce the mundane nature that can sometimes develop. If you're just lecturing a straight 2 hours in a class, students can really doze off. You can actually get bored yourself where you're talking about stuff and you're not getting a response from an audience. So a great way to approach it is to start to think about to chunk your time into sections. And the sections, I think, would reflect two things. They would reflect content, and they would also reflect mode, modality, approach, or a particular style. So in terms of content, of course, you have to get through specific content in your class when you're teaching it. In terms of mode and approach, you want to break things up in such a way that you're not using the same mode of just lecture for the whole class. So all of this is great for a face-to-face class, and a lot of us do this. The challenge in a DE class over Zoom is we maybe don't think in the same framework, but I'm suggesting we might. So what you could do is take the same sort of lecture and figure out the content you need to cover in a particular class. If you're going through chapter 3 in your sociology text, what's covered in chapter 3. You typically can't cover everything in a class session, so maybe you highlight a few key concepts. And then after highlighting those concepts, you can start to think about what is the best way to present those concepts in my class. Again, in the face-to-face class, students can do small group work. You can do demonstrations. Someone can write something on the board. You can do a little bit of lecture. You can show a film. The interesting thing, though, is that most of those things you can actually do over Zoom. So, of course, we can do lecture. Maybe minimize that. We don't want to lecture just straight for 2 hours. Very easy to do. That lecture includes everything visual that you can include in a face-to-face class, ranging from PowerPoint to images to even video clips. You can also, of course, show a film or a video or any media. So film and media, totally fair game. If you don't know how to do that, reach out. You can do that through Screen Share. There are a lot of great resources that Melanie and the library staff have for us, including the Media Education Foundation, which has some really wonderful films that you can show. So you can show those in a live streaming format. There is a little bit of workaround with audio to talk about, but as long as you click Share Computer Sound when you first do that screen share, you're usually pretty good. We can talk about other settings out there, including the high quality audio setting in Zoom that can be really good for making sure that your students hear the best audio definition coming from whatever is streaming that content. You can also do, of course, any of those icebreakers that we've been talking about. Check out the other videos in this series where I discuss all those icebreakers, things including card decks, question decks that allow you to really get your students to turn their cameras on. Those are all easy to do over Zoom. And then, of course, we can do discussions. Discussions, of course, we do very often in our Canvas class in the asynchronous format. But if you want to do synchronous discussions, a lot of different ways you can approach this. You can call on students. You can use randomization in various ways to call on the students, encourage them to turn on their cameras. You can also break students into groups, and those groups then can be a source of conversation. And after the students have their discussions, they can come back to the large group and then have conversations with the larger group. You can also do demonstrations. I've seen some art classes that do wonderful demonstrations where students are working in real time on a project and the instructor is also working on that project. If you're doing anything like software, it maybe is more of what we call a tutorial, where you would do a screen share and you'd be working through, if you're teaching an audio or video class, you'd be working through your particular area that you're covering with that software. And then you could give the students an opportunity by using that screen share option under your settings such that they can share their screens. And then you could have the students each show on their screen what they're working on. And by the way, that's something you can't really do in a face-to-face class unless you have a way of each student sharing their screen. If it's on their laptop, you'd have to really think about. In a smart classroom you could do that, such as in the University Center and in a few classrooms on main campus, but most classrooms you can't do that. And I mention that because one of the cool things about doing Zoom is that it does open up possibilities for more of that technology sharing in real time because everybody can see what's on the screen. That being said, you do have to keep in mind that it's not the same experience being in a face-to-face class as being on Zoom. So as you use any of these particular approaches or activities, lecture, film media, icebreakers, discussions, demos, and tutorials, definitely think about how Zoom and the synchronous formats of Zoom are changing any of the approaches that you might traditionally use in a face-to-face class. But I think in terms of thinking about taking time, chunking it in some strategic ways, you could really begin to approach your class in a way that makes it more interactive and interesting for students. Again, if you think about efficiency in covering content as that one key area, and then secondly, you think about any of the approaches or modalities that you would in a traditional face-to-face class, including many of these that we talked about, I think it could make your class a little more active. One of the key things is to break things up when you're giving a lecture, when you're doing a class session, when you're running a class session, is to really think about making the content interactive and interesting in different modalities and approaches, because if you do things all in the same way, it definitely will maybe cause your students to get a little bit bored, and thus you're not reaching them as well as you could be. So think about these approaches to chunking time in your class. If you have any questions about the technological issues that relate to some of the things I talked about today, definitely reach out and we can have some one-on-one time to talk about these things, or even set up a session in our teaching talks over Zoom. So thanks for listening, and I'll be back with additional videos in this Interactive Shorts video series.